The Battle of Najera was fought on April 3, 1367, in the province of La Rioja, Castile, medieval Spain. It was fought during the First Castilian Civil War, a struggle over the throne of Castile, which pitted King Peter of Castile against his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. The Civil War in Spain turned Castile into a proxy of England and France during the 100 Years' War, with England and France both taking sides in the conflict. Their motivation was partially to gain control over the Castilian fleet, as the Castilian navy was far superior to that of France or England at the time. While England and France fought each other in the 100 Years' War, the Hispanic kingdoms of Iberia, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal were engaged in an 800-year struggle against the Islamic Moors, known as the Reconquista. In 1340, a Christian coalition of Castilian and Portuguese won a great victory over the Islamic Moors at the Battle of Rio Salado. After this battle, never again was a Muslim army able to invade the Iberian Peninsula. During an outbreak of the Black Plague, during the siege of Gibraltar in 1350, the Castilian king Alfonso XI fell ill with the plague and died. With the death of Alfonso, the siege ended. As Castilian forces withdrew from Gibraltar, Alfonso's rival, Yusuf I of Granada, out of respect, ordered his army not to attack the Castilians as they brought the king's body to Seville. The death of Alfonso started a succession crisis over the Castilian throne, which ultimately led to civil war. During his reign, Alfonso had 10 illegitimate children with his lover, Eleanor, who gave a great many titles and privileges to their sons. The most prominent of these was Henry of Trastamara, who inherited the lordship of Nariña. His father Alfonso later made him Count of Trastamara and lord over Limos and Sarria in Galicia, as well as the towns of Cabrera and Ribera. This caused great discontent among many of the nobles, and in particular the Queen, Maria of Portugal, and her son, Peter. When Alfonso died, his 16-year-old son, Peter, inherited the throne, but the early years of his reign were marked with turmoil. Fearing revenge from Peter, Henry and his brothers fled into hiding. Although Eleanor and her sons reached an agreement with Peter to live peacefully in his court, the situation remained unstable. Henry and his brothers went on to stage numerous rebellions against the new king, Peter. King Peter became convinced that his father's lover was the instigator of these uprisings. So, under the advice of his widowed mother, he ordered Eleanor to be imprisoned and later executed in 1351. Eleanor's death only exacerbated the rift within the royal family, however. After his mother's execution, Henry fled to Portugal. He was pardoned by Peter and returned to Castile, but then soon revolted again, this time in Asturias in 1352. He reconciled with his brother, only to rebel against him again in a long intermittent war, which ended with Henry fleeing to France, where he entered into the service of King John II of France. Meanwhile, in 1356, the English, under the command of Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince of Wales, won a stunning victory over the French at the Battle of Poitiers. In the aftermath of this defeat, the French kingdom was plunged into chaos. During the battle, the French king John II was captured, and afterwards held captive in England. The English king Edward III attempted to take the city of Reims, hoping he could then be crowned King of France. But the Reims campaign failed. The Treaty of Brittany was signed shortly after, in 1360, thus ending the first phase of the 100 Years' War. After the Treaty of Brittany was signed, many mercenaries continued to ravage and loot the French countryside. Although France and England were no longer openly at war, each still worked indirectly to undermine the other. One example of this was in 1363, when Charles II, King of Navarre, took advantage of the weakness of the French kingdom while the French king was in captivity, and tried to seize power. King Edward III tacitly supported these Navarrese efforts. But on the 16th of May, the Navarrese were thwarted when they suffered a crushing defeat by the French at the Battle of Cockerel, thanks to the leadership of the Breton general, Bertrand du Guesclin. Occurring simultaneously, war also broke out in 1358 between Castile and Aragon, known as the War of the Two Peters, named after the Aragonese and Castilian kings, both named Peter, Peter of Castile and Peter IV of Aragon. During that conflict, Henry and his men spent time fighting in the Aragonese army. Henry was taken prisoner and once liberated, fled to France once more. When Peter IV of Aragon attacked Castile again, Henry agreed to help him on the condition that he would lend his support to destroying his half-brother. In 1364, King John II of France died in captivity, and Charles V succeeded him as King of France. Hoping to gain a new ally in Castile, the new French king, Charles, agreed to send one of his best generals, Bertrand du Guesclin, to help Henry in his war against Peter. Bertrand persuaded the mercenary free companies to stop pillaging France and instead join him in the expedition to Castile to aid Henry of Trastamara against Peter of Castile. In 1366, Henry assembled a large army in France at Montpellier, comprised of French and Aragonese troops. Together with the help of Bertrand du Guesclin, he then invaded Castile and successfully forced Peter to flee. After having successfully driven Peter from the throne, Henry was crowned king at Burgos. After his coronation, he proclaimed Bertrand his successor as Count of Trastamara and had him crowned as King of Granada. Although this title was only symbolic, as Granada had not yet been reconquered from the Muslims. The dethroned Peter fled north to the lands under English control in France. There, he petitioned the Black Prince of Wales for aid. The Prince of Wales agreed to help Peter's cause and began recruiting a large army of mercenaries, including Gascon, Poitevins, and English nobles, as well as men from Brittany, Navarre, Foix, Germany, England, Calais, and even mercenaries who had previously fought for Henry of Trastamara, but switched sides. Castilians loyal to Peter also joined the army, as well as some Aragonese unhappy with their king. 400 English archers, recruited by John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, the brother of the Prince of Wales, and King James IV of Majorca. In August of 1366, King Peter of Castile, the Prince of Wales, and King Charles II of Navarre met in Bayonne to agree to terms of an invasion. The King of Navarre agreed to allow the Black Prince's army passage to Castile through Navarre. However, he was playing both sides, as the Navarrese king also later promised Henry that he would block the Pyrenees Pass and not allow the invading army to travel through. But in February of 1367, the English mercenaries of Hugh Cavalry, who previously worked for Henry, switched sides and raided several towns of Navarre from the south in a great chevauchée. This forced the King of Navarre to open the way for the army of the Black Prince, and when the army passed through, Charles also provided 300 men who joined the Prince of Wales' army. When Henry heard the Black Prince's army was approaching, he made haste and gathered all the troops he could. He sent Bertrand du Guesclin immediately from Zaragoza back to Castile with his best captains. About 1,000 French men-at-arms joined Henry's army, along with a handful of Aragonese nobles. As Peter and the Black Prince's army continued their march into Castile, Henry used skirmishing and guerrilla tactics in an attempt to wear them down. This was the strategy advised by the King of France and Bertrand du Guesclin, and this strategy was largely successful. Henry's Castilian troops were lighter and had much greater mobility in contrast to Peter's army, which was composed mainly of heavy infantry and heavy cavalry, which was typical of other armies in Western Europe. The Castilian light cavalry was an old tradition in the Spanish military, and they had plenty of practice using these skirmishing tactics successfully against the Moors. In the third week of March 1367, during the Battle of Arenès, known in Basque as the Battle of Ingles-Mendi, or the Battle of the English Mount, a Jeannette vanguard of Henry's army consisting of Aragonese and French knights, led by Don Tello and Arnoul de Audrehem, surprised and completely wiped out a detachment of the Black Prince's army. Henry's vanguard first defeated a scouting detachment which was ahead of the Black Prince's main army. They then headed back to their camp. On their way, they found another detachment of the Black Prince's army, led by the Seneschal of Aquitaine, Sir Thomas Felton, with 200 men-at-arms and archers. After suffering many casualties, the detachment of the Prince of Wales retreated to the mountain, dismounted their horses, and took up a defensive position, entrenching themselves in the side of the mountain, where the English longbowmen resisted the Castilian light cavalry. At first, these attacks failed, but the French and Aragonese were not dismayed. They dismounted their horses and attacked on foot, and finally overran the English position. Sir William Felton, Seneschal of Poitou, was killed during the battle, and many others were captured, including Thomas Felton, Richard Taunton, Sir Hugh Hastings, Lord John Neville, and the Gascon mercenary, Captain Gaillard Vaillère, among others. Up to this point, the army of the Black Prince was considered by many to be invincible. Now they had suffered their first defeat. Even though their losses were minor, and the rest of the army was still very much intact, morale among Peter and the Black Prince's men was now starting to decline. The Prince of Wales continued to march towards Burgos, but Henry was able to block his path and forced the army of Peter to retreat. By the end of March, the Black Prince crossed the river Ebro at Logrono, where he made camp, while Henry once again blocked access to Burgos by positioning his army by the river Najera. By now, time was playing against Henry, as the Castilian nobility saw any effort to delay confrontation with the enemy as dishonorable. Therefore, although he was outnumbered, and despite the opposition of Bertrand du Guesclin and the rest of his commanders, Henry ordered his men to draw up for battle, leaving behind the protection of the river Najera. According to the Chandos Herald, Henry's army was facing east towards Navarrete, and the Black Prince's army marched from Navarrete to Najera, taking a roundabout way at night, and at dawn quietly emerged from behind a hill, surprising the army of Henry, who quickly maneuvered to face the enemy. Now both armies formed themselves up for battle in the open plain. Henry's army consisted of 4 separate battalions. The vanguard, which stood foremost in the center, was under the command of Bertrand du Guesclin, and consisted of French and Breton troops, as well as the flower of the Castilian men-at-arms. Du Guesclin's battalion dismounted from their horse, intending to fight on foot. Flanking Du Guesclin's men, a little to the rear, on either side, were 2 battalions of cavalry and barded horsemen. Those on the left were under the command of Don Tello, another brother of Henry and half-brother of Peter. The cavalry on the right were commanded by Alfonso of Aragon and Foix. Alfonso was the grandson of James II of Aragon and the cousin of Peter IV, King of Aragon. He was Count of Ribagorza, Count of Denia, and the Marquis of Varigna. Alfonso commanded a battalion of Aragonese auxiliaries and cavalry of the military orders. Between the 2 wings of cavalry, in the second line ranged the 4th Battalion, containing both cavalry and infantry. This battalion was commanded by King Henry himself. Also with Henry's army was the Frenchman Arnoul d'Audrehem, a veteran of the Battle of Poitiers, where he was captured by the Black Prince's army. The English army was also organized into 4 battalions. In the center, opposite to Du Guesclin, was the English vanguard, consisting of English and other foreign men-at-arms gathered under the banner of the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt. Also with the vanguard was John Chandos, one of the best military captains of his time, who fought previously with the Prince of Wales at the Battle of Poitiers. Hugh Calverley was also with the vanguard on the English side. Hugh was a mercenary captain who previously had fought in Spain for Henry. Hugh and his 400 lances were about to draw their swords against their former comrades. To the right of the vanguard and opposed to Don Tello were the Gascon men-at-arms led by John I, Count of Armagnac,
as well as men under the command of Thomas Percy.
To the left, facing Alfonso of Ribagorza's men, was Gaston III, Count of Foix, and the Captal de Buch, Jean III de Grailly. De Grailly was also a seasoned veteran. He also fought with the Prince of Wales at Poitiers, and more recently he faced Bertrand du Guesclin at the Battle of Cockerel in 1364, where he was defeated and captured by du Guesclin. The 4th English Battalion was the largest, and contained the banners of the dethroned Peter of Castile, the absent King of Navarre, James IV of Majorca, and finally, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince of Wales. Overall, Peter's army had numerical superiority, with at least 10,000 men present total, including 6,000 mercenaries, 2,000 men from Aquitaine, 1,000 English, 800 Castilians sympathetic to Peter, 500 English longbowmen, and 300 men from Navarre. Henry's army probably had no more than 5,000 men total, including 2,500 Castilians sympathetic to Henry, and 1,000 French mercenaries, and 1,000 men from Aragon. As Peter's army surprised the army of Henry, the vanguard of Henry's army, led by du Guesclin, maneuvered quickly to confront the enemy. But in the confusion, some Castilian horsemen defected to the side of Peter, followed by a larger group of infantry. This put a ticking clock on the situation for Henry. Although these desertions were minor in terms of numbers, they had an effect on the morale of the men, as all of Henry's men now began to view their comrades with suspicion. Henry was therefore forced to abandon the defensive advantage, and sounded the charge. Bertrand du Guesclin led the vanguard as they began to advance on the enemy. When the Prince of Wales saw the enemy advancing towards them, he turned to Peter and said to him, quote, "Sir King, within the hour you will know if you are King of Castile." Close quote. He then cried out to his men, quote,
"Banners, in the name of God and St. George, advance!"
vanguards of the two armies clashed into each other with great force. The forces of the Duke of Lancaster and John Chandos were initially pushed back, but the line eventually stabilized. The fighting was so close that both sides dropped their spears and began using swords, axes, and daggers. According to Froissart, a Castilian knight by the name of Martin Fernandez recognized Chandos during the fighting and provoked him to single combat. They attacked each other vigorously, but their thick armor resisted the strongest of their blows. The Castilian used his larger size and finally managed to grab Chandos by the arm and hurled him to the ground. Chandos grabbed Martin and pulled him down also, and the two struggled together in the dust until finally, the Spaniard overpowered Chandos and placed his knee on his chest, at which point, Chandos pulled out his dagger and thrust it into a gap in his armor, killing him. Now a lifeless mass on top of him, Chandos pushed his dead foe to the side, right at the very moment his comrades had fought their way back to him. Meanwhile, the elite mercenary Gascon companies, who were in the right and left wings, attempted to flank the vanguard of Bertrand du Guesclin. However, they were met by the cavalry charges of Don Tello and Alfonso of Ribagorza. The Castilian light cavalry of Don Tello approached the opposite wing of the enemy, but suffered terrible losses because of the rain of arrows from the English archers. Likewise, Alfonso's Aragonese cavalry fared slightly better, but the men of Jean de Grailly got the better of them, and they too were eventually routed. King Henry himself tried to relieve the vanguard, charging against the Gascon mercenaries several times, but these attempts were to no avail, as the horses were easily killed by the English archers. Fighting on foot was also not an option because the Castilian cavalry considered it a humiliation. With the cavalry on the flanks beaten and demoralized, they fled the field of battle. As some of his men were retreating, Henry tried to rally his men and cried out to them, quote, "Gallant sirs, what do you? Will you now betray me? You who have made me king, turn again, and with God's assistance, the day shall still be ours." The elite Gascon mercenaries under de Grailly and the Count of Armagnac, now unopposed, turned and attacked the flanks of Henry's vanguard commanded by du Guesclin. Now surrounded on three sides, du Guesclin's vanguard continued to fight on. All of Henry's attempts to rally his men and to relieve his vanguard eventually failed, and he finally realized that the battle was lost. The majority of Henry's army, including the king himself, was now in full retreat. Duguclan and his men continued to fight until they saw that Henry had fled the field of battle, at which point Duguclan surrendered and was taken prisoner, along with Arnul de Adrahem, who was also captured. The rest of Henry's army fled toward the bridge of Najera and were pursued by the Aragonese cavalry of James IV of Majorca, who butchered most of them. Many men were trapped in their retreat by the great river, as the bridge was too narrow. A bottleneck formed on the bridge, and many men were slaughtered as they tried to escape. The losses of Henry's army during the Battle of Najera were enormous. Duguclan's men had spent the majority of the battle fighting while surrounded, and had lost almost half of their men, with virtually all of them wounded. According to Froissart, losses for the Prince of Wales' army were light, losing only 4 knights, 2 Gascons, 1 Englishman, and 1 German, as well as 20 archers and 40 foot soldiers. Although Peter and the Prince of Wales had won a great victory, they failed to capture Henry of Trastamara, who was able to flee across the Pyrenees Mountains to France to fight another day. While the Battle of Najera was a nominal victory for Peter and the Black Prince, it came at a great cost. Around 1 in 5 of the English troops who participated in the Spanish campaign did not return home. Edward himself fell ill with dysentery during the campaign and was forced to return to Aquitaine. Relations between King Peter I of Castile and the Prince of Wales soon came to an end, since Peter was not able to repay Edward for the army he hired, or make good on his promises to provide territory to Bayonne. As a result, the alliance between Castile and England ended, and Peter could no longer count on England's support. With the Black Prince gone from Castile, Henry of Trastamara later led a second invasion that ended with Peter's death at the hands of Henry at the Battle of Montiel in March 1369. With the death of Peter, the Castilian Civil War finally ended, with Henry, the first king of the House of Trastamara, now on the throne. The Kingdom of France also found a new ally in Castile, as the new Castilian king Henry provided valuable naval support to the French campaigns against Aquitaine and England. The Castilian fleet would later win a great victory over the English, destroying the English fleet at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372.